Hey guys, welcome back. So, answer. The Raven. The Cask of Amontillado. The Pit and the Pendulum. The Telltale Heart. What are the works of Edgar Allan Poe? Author of poetry, short stories, and famous for his dark, mysterious, and macabre tales. Found delirious in the street, wearing clothes that weren't his, unable to discuss his state. What happened in the death of Edgar Allan Poe? I don't know about you, but I personally have always been a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. There's just something about the darkness in his writings that I love so much. But who was he? Poe was born January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, the second child of his father. He was an actor, David Poe Jr., and actress Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe, an English-born actress. He had an older brother named William Henry and a younger sister named Rosalie. His paternal grandfather, David Poe Sr., immigrated from County Cavern, Ireland, sometime in 1750 and was quartermaster during the American Revolution. Poe's father would abandon the family in 1810, about a year after the birth of Poe. His mother would die December 8th, 1811, from consumption, and Poe would be taken to the home of John Allen in Richmond, Virginia. John, who was a successful merchant dealing primarily in cloth, wheat, tombstones, tobacco, and slaves, would take him in with his family, and they would give him the name Edgar Allan Poe. But he was never formally adopted by the family. In 1812, the Allens would baptize Poe in the Episcopal Church, and John would alternately spoil and punish Poe in the home. The family would sail to the United Kingdom in 1815, where Poe would briefly attend a grammar school in Irvine, Ayrshire, Scotland, where John Allen was from. Poe would rejoin his family in London in 1816, where he attended a boarding school in Chelsea until 1817, and then he would be entered into the Reverend John Bransby's Manor House School in Stoke Newington. In 1820, the family would return to Richmond, Virginia, and in 1824, Poe would serve as a lieutenant of Richmond Youth Honor Guard when the city celebrated a visit from Marquis de Lafayette, the last surviving major general from the American Revolutionary War. John's uncle William Galt died in March of 1825 and would leave John several acres of real estate. William was said to have been one of the wealthiest men in Richmond at the time, and the inheritance left John was around the time estimated to be about $750,000, which would be roughly $22,485,454. I mean, $22 million. I mean, that's just math I can't even fathom. John would celebrate his newfound wealth by buying a 2-story brick house called Moldava. Poe would register at the University of Virginia in February 1826 to study ancient and modern languages, and it is rumored that he became engaged to a woman named Sarah Elmira Royster prior to enrolling in college. The university was still rather new and was established on the ideals of founder Thomas Jefferson. Yes, one of the founding fathers of America and the third president of the United States. The university had strict rules against gambling, horses, guns, tobacco, and alcohol, but these appeared to be more like guidelines than rules, as they were pretty much ignored. Jefferson enacted a system of student self-government, which allowed students to choose their own studies, boarding, and report any violation of the rules to faculty. Pretty much chaos and there was a really high dropout rate. During his time at the university, Poe would lose touch with his fiancée, Sarah. He would become estranged from his foster family. And then Poe would claim that John did not give him enough money to register for classes and buy books. Which makes me question, why are college books so dang expensive? Or, furnish and find a dorm. But John would send more money and clothes, but Poe had increasing debt, allegedly due to gambling. Poe would drop out of college after only 1 year, but he did not return to Richmond as he felt unwelcome, which was compounded when he learned that Sarah had married another man. Poe then would go to Boston in April of 1827 and do odd jobs as a clerk and newspaper writer under the pseudonym Henry Lee Rennett. These odd jobs would not allow Poe the ability to support himself, and so he would enlist in the Army as a private May 27th, 1827, under the name Edgar A. Perry, and claimed to be 22 when he was really 18. He was first stationed at Fort Independence in the Boston Harbor area for $5 a month. It would be this year when he released a 40-page collection of poetry called Tamerlane and Other Poems. Only 50 copies were ever printed, and the book got no attention. His regiment would then be posted in Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina, where Poe was promoted of artificier. He would serve for 2 years and attain the rank of Sergeant Major for Artillery, which was the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could attain. Poe would seek to end his 5-year enlistment by revealing his real name and circumstances to his commanding officer. Lieutenant Howard said that he would allow Poe to leave only if he reconciled with his foster father, John. This would prompt Poe to reach out to John via letter, but John would spend months ignoring Poe's letters and pleas for help. Poe's foster mother died February 28, 1829, and he may not have ever been informed by John that she was ill. Poe did return to Richmond to visit a day after Frances was buried, and it may have been the death of his wife that helped to soften John, as he agreed to help Poe be discharged in order to take an appointment at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Poe was successful in being discharged from the Army on April 15, 1829, once he found a replacement to finish his enlisted term for him. Who knew that was a thing? Prior to entering West Point, Poe would stay for a time in Baltimore with his Aunt Maria Clem, his older brother, and his grandmother. It would be at this time that he would receive words of encouragement from John Neal in a review of Poe's poetry, and this would prompt Poe to dedicate one of his poems to Neal in his second book, Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems, which was published in 1829. Poe would go ahead and enter West Point as a cadet on July 1st, 1830. While there, his foster father John would remarry in October of that year. It would be this marriage and arguments with Poe that led to John disowning Poe completely, and this would then prompt Poe to leave West Point by getting court-martialed on purpose. He would be tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formation, classes, and church in February of 1831. Poe pled not guilty, knowing that this would grant him dismissal because he would be found guilty. After he left, he released a third volume of poems titled Poems. This time, the book was financed with the help of fellow cadets at West Point who donated 75 cents to the cause, which raised $170. He dedicated the book to the U.S. Corps of Cadets. This volume is respectfully dedicated. In March of 1831, Poe would again return to Baltimore to his aunt, brother, and cousin, where his brother Henry was in poor health, due in part to alcoholism. Henry would die August 1st, 1831. We're going to go ahead and speed through some of the rest of this now. So buckle up, kiddies. It's going to be a bumpy ride. After Henry died, Poe began to start his writing career in earnest. This would prove difficult as he was one of the first Americans to choose to live by writing alone, which would be hard due to the lack of international copyright laws. As it turns out, many American publishers would produce unauthorized copies of British works, as opposed to paying for new work by Americans. Then came the Panic of 1837, where there was a growth in American periodicals, many not lasting beyond a few issues, and publishers often refused to pay writers or even pay them much later than originally promised. Yeah, well, we're not going to pay you. I will pay you next Tuesday. All of this would lead Poe to plead for money and other assistance. By this time, Poe had turned to prose instead of poetry and would have a few stories in Philadelphia publication. He would work on his only drama at the time, Politician. He received a prize in October 1833 from the Baltimore Saturday Visitor for his short story, MS Found in a Bottle, which garnered him the attention of John P. Kennedy, who then helped him publish some of his stories and introduced him to Thomas W. White, who was the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. Poe would become an assistant editor in August of 1835, only to be discharged within a few weeks for being drunk on the job. Poe would return to Baltimore again, get a license to marry his cousin, Virginia Clem, in September 1835. Ew. After promising good behavior, Poe would be reinstated to the Messenger and would move back to Richmond with Virginia and her mother. He would remain at the Messenger until January of 1837, and during his time there, he and Virginia were married on May 16th of 1836. In 1838, his novel The Narrative of Author Gordon Pym of Nantucket was published and well received. The summer of 1839, he would come to the assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, where he would publish numerous articles, stories, and reviews. He would also publish the collection Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque in 2 volumes, but he made little money from it, and there were mixed reviews. In 1840, he left Burton's and took a position as writer and co-editor at Graham's Magazine. In 1841, Poe tried to secure a position in the administration of President John Tyler. His hope was to be appointed to the United States Custom House with the help of the president's son, Robert, who knew Poe's friend Frederick Thomas. September 1842, Poe did not show up to a meeting to discuss the appointment, stating that he was ill, but Thomas believed Poe may have been drunk. Poe was promised an appointment regardless. January of 1842, Virginia would present the first signs of consumption and would only partially recover, and this would cause Poe to drink more heavily. He would return to New York, work briefly at the Evening Mirror before becoming the editor of the Broadway Journal. It was while at the Journal he would later become owner of that Poe would alienate himself from other writers, even once publicly accusing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism. Saucy drama. January 1845, Poe's poem The Raven would appear in the Evening Mirror to instant success and made Poe a household name, but he was only paid $9 for the publication. In 1846, the journal would fail, likely due to Poe's drinking, and Poe would move to a cottage in Fordham, New York. It would be at this home when Virginia would die on January 30th, 1847. Poe would become unstable after Virginia's death and would attempt to court poet Sarah Helen Whitman. The two would become engaged. That engagement failed because of Poe's drinking and erratic behavior, and quite possibly meddling by her mother. After the failed engagement, Poe would again return to Richmond and resume his relationship with Sarah Elmira Royster. Things were finally starting to look up for Poe in October of 1849. He was a famous author, would garner huge audiences for the readings of his work, and he was set to marry his first love after returning from a short trip from Richmond to Philadelphia and New York. It would be during this trip that things became sketchy. On September 26th, Poe would visit a doctor in Richmond complaining of a fever. Poe would leave Richmond on September 27th and end up in Baltimore before disappearing for almost a week. On October 31st, he was found in a gutter outside a tavern known as Gunner's Hall by a man named Joseph Walker, who recognized Poe. He was taken aback at the appearance of Poe, not dressed in his typical black wool suit, but rather appeared to be dressed in someone else's cheap, ill-fitting clothing and a straw hat. Walker would offer assistance to Poe if there was anyone that Walker might contact for him, and Poe would mention editor Joseph Snodgrass. Walker would write a letter to Snodgrass. Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward Polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. And he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker, to Dr. J. E. Snodgrass. Poe would be taken to Washington College Hospital, where it's alleged he was kept alone in a windowless room with physician Dr. John Moran to watch over him. There's much speculation about what happened to Poe during the days he was missing, the reason for his seemingly hysterical and rough condition that he was found in, and unreliable witnesses as to his final moments. On October 7th, 1849, Poe would die in the hospital with his last words supposedly being, "Lord help my poor soul." Almost immediately after the announcement of his death, theories began to circulate. Sadly, there are no records that remain about the final hospitalization, but it was listed that he died as a result of pharyngitis, congestion of the brain, which is a polite term used for alcohol or drug overdoses at the time. Though there is also suspicion around the cause of death due to less than precise medical treatment and the motivations of those involved in his final days. No one who knew Poe in life remembered him as a heavy drinker, as he would seemingly go long stretches without drinking at all. But when he did partake, it would not take much to get him into a drunken stupor. The death of Virginia did send him into a long binge from which he eventually recovered, and after some close calls and advice from a doctor, Poe would pledge sobriety and join the Sons of Temperance a few months prior to his death. Joseph Snodgrass was the advocate of the temperance movement and would tour the country using Poe as an example to the dangers of alcohol, writing that when he found Poe at the bar in Baltimore, he was utterly stupefied with liquor, only to produce mere incoherent mutterings. The executor of Poe's estate, Rufus Griswold, Poe's literary rival at the time, who became executor of his works, Wild Times, would use his position to pen a cruel, libelous, and unfortunately authorized biography suggesting the author was not only a drunk, but an opium addict as well. Wow, friends like that. Dr. John Moran, the physician who attended to Poe in his final days, saw all of this happening and said that in no way was Poe drunk. Decades later, he would write his own book titled Edgar Allan Poe, a defense describing a sober and steady Poe reciting poetry on his deathbed. It's theorized that Dr. Moran may have romanticized Poe's death or even started senility at the time. He was the only person in Poe's room. No visitors were allowed, and his credibility has been questioned or even considered untrustworthy due to his changing stories on Poe. Sadly, there remains no hospital records or even a death certificate, theorized to have been lost or maybe never to have existed at all. And for that reason, we get many a theory as to what caused his death. Hypoglycemia, conspiratorial murder plot, Suicide relating to depression, as in 1848, he almost died from an overdose of laudanum. Alcoholism, as suggested by Snodgrass, but his writings on the topic have proven to be untrustworthy. And a man by the name of Thomas Mayne Reid, a one-time drinking buddy to Poe, stated that while they did engage in drinking, Poe, quote, never went beyond the innocent mirth in which we all indulge. He didn't dismiss Poe's failures, but he did say, I can't speak truly of its not being habitual. I can speak truly of its not being habitual. As stated, Poe joined the Sons of Temperance prior to his death, and William Glenn, who administered Poe's pledge, would write years later that the temperance community had no reason to believe that Poe had violated his pledge. A drug overdose, proven untrue, but still suggested. A man by the name of Thomas Dunn English, no friend of Poe, but a physician, stated that Poe was not a drug addict, writing, had Poe the opium habit when I knew him before 1846, I should both as a physician and a man of observance have discovered it during his frequent visits to my rooms, my visits to his house, and our meetings elsewhere. I saw no signs of it and believe the charge to be a baseless slander. Other theories. Several forms of rare brain disease, a brain tumor, diabetes, various types of enzyme deficiency, syphilis, apoplexy, delirium tremors, epilepsy, meningeal inflammation, heart disease, lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, based on a 2006 sample of Poe's hair. Cholera, as Poe had passed through Philadelphia in early 1849 during a cholera epidemic. A couple of more theories are interesting. One is that Poe was the victim of violence due to the fact that he was found outside a tavern that was being used as a polling place, which was common then to have voting take place in drinking establishments, which maybe might not be a bad idea today, but maybe it would be a really bad idea. So never mind, I didn't say anything. It's proposed that Poe may have gotten caught up in a form of election fraud known as cooping. What is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay, so it's kind of crazy. Apparently, it was common practice at the time for corrupt politicians to pay gangs and thugs to kidnap down-and-out men, particularly the homeless. The men would be drugged, beaten, or plied with alcohol and forced to vote many times at different polling places disguised in different clothing, and once they had voted as forced, they would be left for dead. Given the state of Poe on the night of October 31st, 1849, in ill-fitting clothing and being incoherent, this theory is one that has gained much attention. The final theory was posed in 1996 when doctors were presented with a hypothetical patient describing the following symptoms. Patient was comatose when admitted to the hospital. The next day, he was perspiring heavily, hallucinating, and shouting at imaginary people. He seemed better the following day, but could not recall falling ill. On the fourth day, patient again was confused and belligerent. Patient had throat spasms and was unable to drink water. These are all symptoms that Poe presented with and led Dr. R. Michael Benitez, MD, a cardiologist, to conclude that the hypothetical patient died as a result of rabies. Dr. Benitez concluded that the hypothetical patient was likely Poe, given the lack of CT scans and MRI results, and the patient being identified as EP, a writer from Richmond. According to another doctor, Henry Wild, MD, who frequently treats rabies, Poe had all the features of encephalitic rabies. There's no evidence that Poe was bitten by a rabid animal, and 25% of rabies patients say they can't remember being bitten. Symptoms can take up to a year to appear after the initial infection, and by the time they do appear, most patients die within a few days. What do you think, though? Drugs? Alcohol? Some other medical issue? Cooping? Rabies? Syphilis? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. you have a favorite writing by Poe? Let me know that too. Hey, and while you're down there, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and I will see you in the next MysHistory video.